1920 or 1919, 1920, my parents decided to send my two brothers to America, where my uncle Vartan was, and I had another uncle named Onik. He was a Gedikian, and my uncle Vartan was a Yazejian. So my parents sent my two brothers to America, and then we didn't stay in Ardabazar anymore either. We went to a city closer to Istanbul because we thought, well, we're going to go anytime to my
America.
Mother wouldn't stay there. But my father was like a janitor in a school. He was purchasing things for them and cleaning, and that's how we were living. And when my parents decided to send my brothers to America, then my mother said, all right, it's time for us to go. So we decided we weren't going to stay there any longer either. We asked my uncles to send us affidavits to come to America. In the meantime, my uncle Vartan wanted to get married. He was a young man of 34 or 35. So he wrote to my mother and said, find me a nice bride. And he sent his picture, and my mother looked around to see, because there was a lot of orphan young girls whose parents had died in the massacre. So my mother and my father looked around, and they found a nice girl for my uncle. The four of us then came to Istanbul, and we took the boat, the ship, from Istanbul to America. We came, it took us a long time because it was a kind of a slow boat. Then when we got to America, my uncle was able to take his bride to be out immediately because he was a citizen and bride-to-bes were allowed, but the quota for sisters had been closed.
The immigration people.
Immigration said, the quota is closed. I'm sorry, your sister and her family cannot come, which was my mother and us, but your bride-to-be can go out. Well, I think we were all very disappointed. We were afraid we were going to be sent back to Istanbul again, and we begged my uncle or whoever we could find to let us stay. Finally, through some heartache and red tape, they got it so that we could come to America, to stay in New York or America, on a visitor's permit. And we were allowed to come. My mother was happy because then we could see my brothers, which she had not seen over a year. Then my father took my two brothers, who were 19 and 21 years old, to Istanbul and put them on a boat and send them to America. My uncle was very glad to have them. Then my father came back, and my mother said, I'm not going to live in this country anymore. We're going to go to America too. That's my mother. So my father said, that sounds good. He also had a brother in Canada. So my father and mother and I and my aunt and uncle, we went to another little city which is called Izmir. That's a country, another city. We went there and lived there for about a year. My mother couldn't stand being away from her two sons. So we applied to come to America also. We went to Istanbul. We got on the King Alexander boat. Big ship. I was only 6 years old, and I had a cousin whose name was Harite. He was standing on the shore waving goodbye to me. He was my only friend that I had at that time. And to this day, I can remember that. He does too.
Mm-hmm.
So we passed Greece, and when we by the way, I forgot. My uncle told my mother, bring me a bride. I want to get married. So my mother in Izmir looked around to see where there was a nice eligible girl for my uncle. My mother found my aunt Nuvart, and she went to the parents and said, I would like to take your daughter to my brother as a bride. They were thrilled to have their daughter come to America. So that's fine. So my mother and my father and I took my Aunt Nuvart with me. She wasn't my aunt at that time. We brought her to America, and then we, not having that much money, we were in the
Cargo area?
Cargo, I guess.
Cargo area.
Yeah, cargo area. I think that's what it's called. But they were very nice to us, and I used to play with friends. In fact, at that time, Alice Garbadian, who was at that time, I don't know what her last name was, because when she came here, she was adopted by her father. And she was my playmate in the ship, and then later on, I was godmother at her wedding, matron of honor. That's the way those things go sometimes. Ralph's mother is who I'm talking about, Ralph and Eddie's mother. So as we came nearer to the shore, everybody was sick. Old women, young women, there was no special things. My mother, I think, spent most time in bed in her stateroom or whatever. It wasn't a stateroom, they all slept together. Anyway, we came to Ellis Island, and the merchants would come to the boat in small sailboats, and they would sell things. Well, we didn't have much money, but we saw them selling something yellow in bunches, like this. So my mother said we should try that, and it was bananas. So you put your money in the basket, and you put it down to the ocean, and
by a rope or something.
By rope, of course, by rope, and the man in the sailboat puts whatever he needs, takes the money out, sends it up. It was something like a pulley. Like a pulley rope. How can I remember that? I'm pretty good.
Yeah.
Then it was time for my aunt. We were at Ellis Island. They wouldn't let my parents and I through because the immigration for
Quota.
immigration. That's not what I mean to
Quota.
say. The quota for sisters was finished, so they could not let my mother as a sister come through. But I had a cousin and an aunt in New York City. My cousin was a very bright lady. She went to her minister and said, my aunt and uncle are here from Istanbul. They will not let her out because quota's finished. Man says, don't worry. He went to their House of Representative person and told him, this lady has a uncle and aunt that won't let through. They have to go back and come back another time. The man said, I'll take care of it. I don't know what he did, but he got us through. But we had to be on 1922 quota. We had gotten here in 21, but he said they're going to be on 1922 quota, then they'll be fine. But they'll be here as visitors for the year, and it won't bother. Don't worry about it. So we said fine. Now my aunt and uncle were anxious to get married. This is in October. My uncle wants to come back to his business here in Detroit. So they were anxious to get married. My aunt wouldn't get married. She said, no, and not until your aunt, your sister, and your brother-in-law are back in safely here. I'm not going to marry you. She was very adamant about that. She loved my mother. So they said, fine. My uncle said, okay, that was a good engagement time for them to know each other. So we were on the Ellis Island for about 40 days because we were going to be safe, but at that time, but we were not allowed out. Then after 40 days, my mother was saying, please let my sons come here so I can at least see them before I'm sent back. Then when our visa went through as a visitor, she was happy. We went to New York, Brooklyn, New York. My aunt and uncle got married, and they came to Detroit. We stayed there for a little while. Then we came to Detroit also. And we were allowed to come. My mother was happy because then we could see my brothers, which she had not seen over a year. Then we came to Detroit, and a year later, in 1922, the quota for sisters opened, and we were allowed to stay here permanently. That's my story to come to America.
You didn't come through Ellis Island, did you?
Yes, we came, though. I missed that part. We came through Ellis Island to get out when we were, when they had said, all right, now you can stay in America. We had to go through Ellis Island. we had stayed in Ellis Island for 40 days because while they did all this, I think they had a special Congress something for us. I don't know.
Where did you stay at Ellis Island? Right
in the Ellis Island. In the building. They had dormitories though. No, not the ship. In the Ellis Island, they had dormitories for us.
Okay.
And because I was a child, I enjoyed myself.
Sure.
My parents didn't, but I did. Then they put us through a very, very, very mental and health tests, and they made sure that we were very healthy and very mentally alert. In fact, they gave my parents a writing test, even if they didn't know how to write English. They had them write in their own language so that they would know that they were able to carry their own weight. And also they had to have some money with them so as not to be a burden on my uncle, who was our sponsor, or to the American government.